Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest InSport Education Business of Sport webinar. Got a great group of individuals for discussion this morning, talking about a ever more pressing topic around the potential for an independent football regulator. Now, the more astute of you will note that there's myself and two speakers. Natalie is due to join. She's just having a couple of technical issues, but I'm sure she will join us as and when possible. So bear with us on that. So Tracy Crouch, who's chairing the government's fan-led review of football, which came about after the much publicised demise of the European Super League, seems to have all but confirmed that an independent regulator for football is an inevitability. And what we want to talk about today is that the case? Is a football regulator right for the game? And if so, what will be the remit for that regulator, and what will be its powers, and what will the changes be that it'll aim to bring about? To discuss that, we've got a fantastic panel who I'll briefly introduce. We have John Purcell, who's co-founder of business intelligence firm Visible. John and his colleagues have written some fascinating papers on the financial state of football and some of the harsh realities that are facing the game from a financial point of view. And I strongly recommend anybody out there have a look at the Visible website and read some of those papers. But make sure you've got a stiff drink when you do so. It makes for quite scary reading. And we have Natalie with us. Hi, Natalie. Natalie is briefly with us, but Natalie is former CEO of Southport Football Club, current MD of Oldham Athletic, where she has overseen some major changes to the club's governance structures. And last but by no means least, Niall Cooper, who's a board member at AFC Wimbledon, and also director of Fair Game, which is a growing group of football clubs, now up to 19, he informs me this morning, all of whom are committed to far-reaching changes to the governance of football in the wider interests of the sport. So I'm going to dive straight in with a rather obvious question, but one which I think bears some consideration. John, I'm going to ask you, does football need an independent regulator, and is that the best approach for the game?
Okay, good question. We would go back a number of steps, and so we'll actually, before any decisions are made with regards to a regulator or how a supervisory or regulatory role is fulfilled, is that football needs to understand its own financials and economics. And until it does that, then it's not going to be in a position to manage itself adequately going forward. In fact, we'll probably find ourselves going through exactly the same processes and machinations in 3, 4, 5 years' time. And now the reason why we say that is that unless you are measuring to the nth degree, to the ultimate level of transparency in terms of football's financials, the chances are that if an independent regulator or regulatory body is appointed, they will make incorrect strategic decisions based on incorrect information. And we see this example, see examples of this time and time again and asking the question, we're doing all the right things, but the share price isn't moving. What do you think is happening? So we go off and do a value audit of the business, and we actually go back and present them information that they probably haven't seen before, and we end up knowing more about their business than they do, and we're able to identify the value drivers and also the areas within the business that's destroying value, and from that point they are then
Oh, I think we've got a few connection challenges for John. Niall, I'm gonna turn that question to you until John comes back online. Do we need a regulator?
Yeah, great question. I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the reason for that is we have to look at where football's got to now. And that's, what are we wanting from football? What do we really want? And we want to see a protection of the history and traditions of football. We don't want to see a repeat of what's happened with Bury and what's happened with Macclesfield and the risk that it puts to decades of those traditions. That's the starting point. So from that, then you're then looking at how do we protect it? How do we do that? And the history of what we've seen over the last, fortunately, now probably spreading to 10, 20, 30 years, is that there hasn't been that kind of protection there. There hasn't been that kind of a surety that we need. Now, from a fair game perspective, what we want from a regulator is looking at what we've defined as a sustainability index, which is to measures that football clubs would have to pass to be able to access funds or to avoid penalties. Now those things include very much, as John was just talking about, is financial sustainability. And John's completely right that there is no consistent way of measuring that. And we're at Fair Game, we're very keen on having real-time accountability, real-time financial accountability, but on a consistent level. So actually going through everybody filing accounts in the same way and looking at so we can have real clear transparency, which doesn't exist at the moment. We're aware for our experts, and we've got 40 odd now that are looking at all these different things, that there are something like 77 different ways of accounting within EFL. Obviously, which means you can't compare like with like. And some people will go into quite detailed and really good accounts, and other people are just doing, almost out of date tokenistic accounts, which becomes a real problem. So we need to address that if we're going to have a real sense about what the problems are within football. On top of that, we also believe that things like fan and community engagement need to come into play, equality standards, and actually transparency and good governance practices that you have. Now, all of these sort of things already exist in different sectors. It's about taking best practice and bringing that all together. We believe as a collective of those four things, that will lead to really good sustainability in football and really will lead to the history and traditions of football being protected. That only really needs to come through from an independent regulator, because if you've got a regulator that's got fingers in various different pies, then you either see an ineffective regulator or you see something that's not going to be fair and equitable. And that's really what we need to get to. Otherwise, we're just going to be, as John mentioned before, the gremlins caught him on the internet world. We'll just see repeating these mistakes time and time again. And I think that's where we're in a really unique position with Tracy Crouch's review to deliver something that is sustainable and long-term and really helps to change the way football operates now. Yeah.
John, are you there, or are we just looking at an avatar?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Terrific.
Still here, still breathing.
Good stuff. Might be easier if you keep your webcam off. That sometimes helps a little bit. But you were just discussing a little bit about the sort of financial, I suppose, literacy, if you will, of clubs and football broadly, and the impact of that on the regulator. So just wondering if you could expand on that a little.
Yeah, when we first started looking at football in 2016, we were very surprised to see that the narrative is very much about revenue. An awful lot of self-promotion about revenue, particularly from the clubs, but also from the administrative bodies and some of the agencies that support those administrative bodies. And when we see rankings of clubs by revenue, it's expressed as a measure.
John has been struck down. I think, and I won't put words in his mouth. And actually, I know that his co-founder Roger is on the chat, so he might be able to comment a little bit in the chat box. But I think John's point is that a lot of football clubs have been benchmarked against revenue, which is all well and good. But if you're spending a lot more than you're earning, then financially that's unsustainable. So talking about the richest football clubs based on how much they earn doesn't really give a fair reflection of value creation or the financial sustainability of clubs. Thank you, Roger. Hi, Natalie. How are you?
I'm so sorry.
That's not.
I think my computer and I think we're Zoom fatigue.
No problem. No problem. I'll ask you the same question as I'd asked John and Niall. Is, do we need an independent regulator?
Absolutely, I do believe we do, and I've been having this discussion and thought process for a long time now since it was announced. The review is, what will the regulator regulate? What element of football is to be regulated? If there is to be a wholehearted and transparent and open review of football, which obviously Tracy Crouch is leading on, and obviously Fair Game and other organisations are getting involved in, where does it start and where does it stop? For me, there needs to be a full and complete review of football, every element of it, and what comes out of that. I agree, needs to be an independent regulator, but at what level, at what stage, at what parts of football? Is it starting at grassroots and is it moving right through to the professional game? Even as, you know, we're seeing huge amount of success, which I do think needs to be patted on the back, the England squad at the moment, and is to be celebrated. But what element of the regulator regulates the parts of football? Because football has become so complex. And has become, in my view, overcomplicated, and we do need to uncomplicate it. So yes, I agree. An independent regulator needs to happen, but at what does it regulate, and what elements of football does it regulate?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and I will hold my hands up here to being informed around football. Question I would ask is, will a regulator impact investment levels coming into football? And Niall, I wonder if you could comment on that.
It's very echoey, so I missed quite a bit of that question. So can you repeat it?
Whether a regulator will impact levels of investment in football.
Whether a regulator will, sorry.
Whether football will be, the levels of investment in football will be impacted by a regulator.
I mean, that's a very good point. I think the reality is probably yes, but then it's actually about who do you want to be investing in football? Because you can get people that will come in, you can get owners that come in, and the thing with every owner is they either get bored, they go bust, or they walk away, or they die, and then what? So you need to be thinking about the people that come into football need to be the people that actually have a long-term interest in the game. And they really care about what we're talking about and the history and traditions of football. Football isn't like any other business. You know, there are so many fans and there's so many communities involved in it. So the more that you attract the funding that comes through from people that are only in it for a short-term gain, then you actually risk the future of the game itself. That does mean that there are certain individuals that might not be interested in investing in football. And I think that's something that we need to accept. But that does lead to a better security of football. And actually, weirdly, I believe that long term it could mean a higher investment in football, because certain financial businesses, financial companies would be more interested in investing in football if they saw it as a secure business, or something that actually has got a long-term sustainability, which doesn't exist if you've got people that are flipping in and out of football. And that's what the situation is now. So we need to have that security that comes through from the flag owner suggesting sustainability index. I think you will see with an independent regulator probably a short-term dip in funding, because you have the bad people no longer want to invest in football. But the long-term benefit is that you'll have business, you'll have banks, and you'll have financial institutions saying that football actually is a secure business, which they don't see at the moment. When you talk to a lot of League One and League Two clubs, one of the big problems they have is that financial institutions aren't interested in investing in them because they see football as a risky business. It's something that isn't a secure investment. And we need to get to a point where that is no longer the case. And until football tidies itself up and becomes a much more economically secure investment, that's not going to be the case. And that puts a lot of clubs at risk. And certainly my club, out of England, we've had to take loans for a new stadium at ridiculously high interest rates because we've gone through it all and said, yeah, fine. And then the last question is, are you a football club? Answer yes, and then interest rates suddenly jump up. That's the situation, that's the outcome, because of loads of other clubs who have been endangering football. And we need to look at that. And I think that's where ultimately a regulator could benefit football long term.
Natalie, what's your view on that?
Now I use two words there for me, long term and sustainability. And that is absolutely key. What also comes with that is the right ownership. And I'm just reading some comments down the side in terms of from Roger, who's just put a note. Most, I think that's EFL clubs would struggle to meet an economic sustainability test. But with the right ownership and long-term sustainable plan that meets the needs of the fan base, the community, inclusive in that the business community, also adheres to the economic sustainability and a business plan of that football club. That's where the change needs to come. What football has been through is a terrible period of where ownership has, and there are some incredible people out there and incredible ownership, but there has been some poor ownership out there, and where that needs to change at the core heart of it, particularly within EFL clubs, is that the ownership and their long-term vision, plan, strategy, whether that be business or economic, has to be challenged, and that's where an independent regulator comes in. It's got to be protecting the assets, protecting the badge, protecting shirt colours, protecting its community, protecting its fan base, being open and more transparent to its fan base. And we've seen, and I've experienced it, we've seen it's where that doesn't happen, you start to see fans turn, you start to see businesses walk away. And that's when the heart of the football club starts to disappear, and that's incredibly important. So for me, Niall hit the nail on the head there, long-term and sustainable, and owners have to be challenged about that. We have to challenge that back as well. An independent regulator has to challenge back, where's your sustainability plan on how are you going to financially support and uphold this football club?
I think most people would agree with those sentiments. So if we're in agreement that a regulator is required, what should its remit be? Niall?
To what we call that sustainability index, I'll come back to, which basically means being able to audit a football club on various different elements. So looking at whether the club is financially sustainable, whether it is meeting the quality standards, whether it is meeting proper community engagement standards, whether it is delivering good governance. All of those things need to come into it. Now, Natalie and I have been talking a bit about this, and at the moment what you have is in football academies you have category 1 to 4, and effectively what I'd like to see from an independent regulator is the same category status 1 to 4 being applied to football clubs on that, and that's something where a regulator would need to come in and look at delivering that. In addition to that, there are elements about the maintaining of a license, effective license, potentially within football. And that license would be looking at, this is something we're still exploring a fair game, so it isn't an absolute, we haven't nailed it now, but it's something that protects the club badge, the club colours, the club name, the club location. And that is an entity that is held almost separate from the commercial avenues of the football club. And that's something that we'd want a regulator to be able to protect. And those are the kind of big things that we need to look at. Those are the elements that I think, if we implemented, would create the sustainability of football that we all want to see. And I think that's the big remit that an independent regulator needs to do. It's that maintaining of the history and traditions of football.
Natalie?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, many clubs across the country have a rich history, and it's something that obviously Niall and I have been speaking about and got some real ideas in terms of. A football club is at the heart of its community. A football club is about the people that supports it. An owner coming into that football club needs to understand that rich history of that town, of that football club. Where we talked about an independent regulator coming in and auditing, ensuring that that club is meeting the standards and it doesn't just become a tick box. The code of governance, as an example, is a real area that I'm so incredibly passionate about, that clubs, national governing bodies, whoever it might be, isn't using it as a tick box. Use it as a vehicle to make the diversity of thought of your football club and your board and your staff and your fan base not become tokenistic. It actually becomes embedded in a representation of your town, of your club. So that's one of the areas that an independent regulator would monitor, and that was also could be based on the amount of funding that you receive as a category status football club. The same takes place with any academy within the pyramid. So if you have a Cat 1 to Cat 4 status, the Premier League auditing company manages those category statuses within the football club, and each year you receive an annual audit, you receive a plan, you receive a strategy, and then you're awarded your category status and your funding based on achieving a certain amount of things within the EPPP programme, the Elite Player Pathway programme. That works for me. It's a good model. I've gone through that process with my previous football club. We adhered to it. We set up a technical board to manage that internally, and it is based on you. And you were then based on your funding. That I think that idea could be used and mirrored within other areas of the game. So safeguarding, code of governance, how you're managing your safeguarding, your equality, and a whole host of other areas within the football club. So it's for me, that's where the independent regulator comes in. And those are the areas that could be managed by a said organisation.
Okay. Thanks, Natalie. Hi, John.
Hi.
Quick, just sort of going back a little bit, there's a couple of comments on this in the comments box. The players' wages and agents' fees are a huge drag anchor on progress in terms of sustainability. So how do you weigh up regulation against free market economics and employment law to try and get those issues under control? Because I think for most people, a player salary cap and better control over agents and fees would go a huge way to supporting financial sustainability, but that seems to be quite a difficult set of circumstances.
I think the important point with that is, aside from issues with regards to employment law and of free market economics. Ultimately, it's the club owners that take the decision whether or not to pay a particular player and a particular agent the amount of money that they're asking for. And what's happened over the years is that owners' ambitions have far outweighed economic sensibility, and so we've ended up in a situation now where, if looking at the top two divisions in England, the Premier League and the Championship, over the last 4 years, they've accumulated economic losses north of £3 billion. And that's driven by, in the main, the bargaining power of players and agents. But it's only, that bargaining power only exists because owners are sharp enough to pay them.
Yeah, so Niall, so how can a question here from John's colleague Roger, how does a regulator address that massive issue?
And that's, we go back to this index concept and this Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, Cat 4 scenario, where you look at, start saying that you can only access those funds. Well, we're looking at the redistribution of parachute payments. Ultimately, you can only access those funds if you reach a certain level of status, and you get a different amount of funding if you're a Cat 1 club or a Cat 2 club or a Cat 3 club or a Cat 4 club. What that does is it starts changing the way your club operates, because it becomes economically beneficial to live within your means. Because you start, one of those criteria is obviously about financial sustainability, and the clear one on that is don't spend more than you earn. I mean, like, it should be a no-brainer, but then if you get to that, that helps you get into a Cat 1 status. And we would actually advocate don't spend more than, say, 7% or 60% of your income on players' wages, because that's the big spend. And that will help you get into a Cat 1 status. And at Cat 1 status, that's when you start getting part of the money from the redistributed parachute payments. So you start incentivising good behaviour. And that's the bit that exists. Rather than doing penalty clauses, you need to be moved into that where it's beneficial to be well run. And you start losing funding if you are not in that status. That's where it needs to go through. You need to move towards a carrot and a stick scenario. In the stick scenario, you'd obviously be looking at the classic reduction of point penalties or things like that. But I think the easier one is to look towards financial rewards for running well. Because at the moment, you have a load of good clubs that are actually doing, good governance, they're abiding by the equality standards, and actually almost a detriment for them because they're seeing other clubs running rings around the rules and the governance of football. And until we look at readjusting that and saying, right, the money that we give out to football that comes through from the TV revenue, that comes through from the solidarity payments and parachute payments, until that money is used to help and reward and incentivise good behaviour, then we're going to be running around in circles. That's where we need to look at it coming through, and that's where the power of a regulator to reward and incentivise clubs through that financially could really be a massive game changer in football.
Natalie, just turning away from the financial side a little bit, diversity and representation within football is obviously hugely important, and I know is an area you've done a huge amount of work on, both at your current club and previously. How much of that should fall within the remit of the regulator?
Diversity and equality and inclusivity should flow through everything that you do. It shouldn't be a tick box. There's actually another project I'm working on, particularly with females in sport and leadership roles. It's hugely important, and what clubs should be representative of is their communities. So I'm not about ticking a box to the number of different types of communities that sit on a board, or ticking a box to the number of types of people that should work within the football club. But what being representative of your community does, it gives diversity of thought, it gives different ideas, brings in the community, it brings in different types of authorities and local community people that can add real value. So for me, the independent regulator should be one of the areas the independent regulator should be really managing and be kind of ensuring that financial rewards, or those incentives that Niall talked about, is that diversity, inclusion, and being an equitable football club for its fan base.
Yeah, I think that's a view we all share. John, just on that point, what's your sort of views on how far the regulatory process should go outside of the financial side is an obvious area, but how far should that their reach of that regulatory body go?
In all honesty, I'm not really equipped to pass comments in terms of what happens outside the financial sphere. Our focus has always been on the financial and economic side of it. If I put my fan hat on and look at it from that perspective, then to me there needs to be some sort of structure in place over and above what's there at the moment that helps to protect clubs. The issue of intellectual property rights over imaging, badges, absolutely correct, completely agree with that. In terms of the fan engagement element, I'm going to put the economic hat back on with the fan hat. And I think, yes, the fan engagement side of it, yes, I'd love to see that. But how do you empower fans on company boards? Unless they're a bona fide shareholder, I find that one a little bit difficult to work through. And yes, there are already fan representatives on certain boards, but when it comes down to it, and when those important financial decisions are made, and that's really what's driving a lot of the problems and issues that we find in football at the moment. We do find that one a little bit difficult to look at. So in the main, as I said at the very outset, all these things are wonderful, great from a fan perspective, but unless you get the real basic foundation right, it's highly likely that a lot of these things may not happen in the way that you want them. But also, it's worth remembering that the process of defining what a regulator does and what a regulatory body does is really going to be a series of balances and trade-offs. And whilst that wish list is very long and very meaningful, not everything on there is going to go through. In fact, in our last blog on our website, we were quite critical actually in terms of the makeup of the fan-led review panel. We think it's heavily weighted towards Premier League interests. So we think there's an element of protectionism running, the protectionist thread running through it. We're not quite convinced that a lot of the things that people are calling for will actually happen. And as I say, our fear is that we're going to be doing this in 3, 4, 5 years time.
Thanks, John. I think that raises a very interesting point around to what the sort of executive capability of any regulator, and the risk, of course, is in several months' time, to great fanfare, there's an independent regulator brought in that really has very limited ability to impact the bigger issues, which I think we've touched on at the moment. And there's also a huge challenge of the brutal realities that fans want different things from their football clubs than owners. Not always, but quite often those interests are misaligned. Fans want new players, they want success on the pitch, whereas the ownership have perhaps broader business objectives at play. So do you think this is a situation where we either need an all singing, all dancing regulator with real teeth that can bring about change, or would you settle for something sort of in the middle, or do you think having a sort of halfway is not really worth the effort? And Niall, I'll ask you that question to go first.
Thanks. I was absolutely biting the bit to answer all of that. I think we have to go for all singing. Otherwise, what's the point? Because otherwise, we're just going to be missing a really unique opportunity. And certainly, we will be lobbying and campaigning and working hard to offer the best solutions that we can get to really fix all the problems within football. And there are many. I want to come back to the point about supporters on the board as well. And I think that's a legitimate one. I think what we need to be looking at is supporters' trust having the skills and the expertise to step in if need be. And that means they have to have the right governance structures. And that goes back to one of the other questions that was in the chat, which is about the owners and directors test, which I think needs to go not just beyond to a director or an owner, but they actually need to be having the right business skills, the right director skills, economic skills. I mean, we definitely should be looking at financial directors of football clubs should be part of that test, because you want to have people that are capable of running football. I come from AFC Wimbledon, and we certainly, when we started out, we didn't have that skill base, and we were making it up. And we were lucky in the sense that we managed to find people relatively quickly to do some of the issues, but it is not an easy job. And the other issue when you've got fans on boards when there are only one or two on a board is they become tokenistic and ignored because the conversations are happening elsewhere. So you need to look about how you deal with that. All of that said, this goes back to the concept of the golden share, which is the bit that you look at what should be protected. And that's where you go back to the badge, the heritage, the kit, the colours and all of those elements, which I think are really important to be protected. And that's where I think you need to look at that being guaranteed. And that effectively could either come through from a golden share. I know that there are models within Germany that look at protecting that in a different way, or whether it becomes part of a license. And those are elements that I think need to be definitely something that we can see. And on my all singing and all dancing regulator, that's definitely one thing that I will be really advocating and pushing, because we need to have that protection in place. And we also need to look at proper real-time financial sustainability. I think we've explored the idea of whether you have the Dutch and the German licensing model, where you effectively have an Offstead approach, which means that when you identify a club in problems, then they can actually be given advice and ultimately be taken over in the very extreme examples, as has happened in Holland. Those sort of things I think we need to aim for, and we need to not be scared, because these sort of things happen in other sectors. The argument that you can't do it in football is just a complete misnomer. I think we need to go and say, well, let's have what we need to have. Let's not have a whole load of things that sit on a dusty shelf going nowhere. We need to have these solutions, and we need to embed them. And I think we will get an independent regulator when that happens. That won't be the end of it for third down. We will be looking to make sure that we have realistic changes that actually mean something long term and secure the game long term. So I won't settle for a halfway house. I know the 19 clubs that I represent won't settle for a halfway house. And I think when you look at supporters' trust, they certainly wouldn't settle for a halfway house, and so why should we? Let's not go for the kind of a middling through, ineffectual fix. Let's go for the real thing.
Yeah. And Natalie, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, just bear with me. I agree. There's no point in starting this process without the end game, excuse the pun, being a full review and a full review of the game and every element of it, and having an independent regulator or whatever the outcome might be that changes the face of football and how it's managed. I just wanted to pick up on that point that Niall mentioned around fans sitting on boards, and I firmly believe this. One fan on the board doesn't have a full and real voice, if that makes sense. How do you get to fans having a real voice on the board and enabling things to be managed, changed, monitored, that are for the integrity of the fan base and its football club and its community. So I'm really supportive of, and I think this, you know, I've been in situations where it has been one fan on the board, and that, unfortunately, that they don't get a say, because then it comes down to the ownership to make the decision. Fans need to be heard, and how fans are heard is either through a fans trust that's well structured, it's got good governance as well, but where they're heard then in any decisions that need to be made by the ownership of the football club, whether it be, you know, we want to build a new training facility, or we're going to move to a new ground because we want to get bigger, or it's we want to link with this local business. Those decisions are made at board level, and that's where the fans need to be involved. So having one person on a board cannot be the full voice for 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, 50, 60,000, hundreds of thousands of fans. So the golden share for me is a huge area that needs discussion and regulating differently, and fans do need to have more say. Super League, that some of the Premier League clubs have come out and going to be able to be the voice of.
Yeah, and I think that touches on Roger's sort of final question here, which is how, you know, that difficult balance between economic sustainability in running a business and serving the community, or being a fan-led, fan-managed business or football club. You know, fans tend to have a fairly short time horizon. It's win the next match. Businesses need to have a longer-term vision, and I think there's often those two are at loggerheads. So, you know, that is that a manageable situation? Can you have both? I can see Niall nodding enthusiastically here, but you believe that there can be a balance between economically sustainable football and serving the community in which they operate?
I think actually that is the way to sustainability. Because if you look at investing within your community, if you look at investing within your local area, then what you have is you create a unique connection between that community that means that those people look at that and they go, that football club is part of my area, part of my community. I actually have an affinity to that. So when I see community programs sponsored by, say, Bolton Wanderers and health initiatives by Bolton Wanderers, you know, school programs by Bolton Wanderers, and I can go to my ground and there's stuff that's helping with dementia and there's stuff that's helping at that. And suddenly you're looking at the long-term affinity to that club and that community becomes so embedded that people they look at they want to spend their money in the ground, they want to be connected with their ground, they will feel proud to put on that shirt to that club because it means more than just the results on Saturday. That is a route to sustainability. That is the kind of stuff that we have had feedback through from our clubs, and we've had feedback through from our experts. If you invest in your local areas, then you actually long-term have a sustainable football club. So when your owner walks away or disappears, you actually have a club that is economically secure because of you are part of that community. That's what makes football so uniquely different, because of the history and tradition that goes with football. If you care about your community and you care about your fans, then you have a sustainable model. That's the big difference. It's not like football's not like any other new business. It isn't just about the economics of what happens in the stadium. It's about that affinity. It's about that fan connection. Investing in that creates a secure football club. That's where I see the sustainability. And that's what, for me, as director of Fair Game, that's what I've heard time and time again from all of the 19 clubs we represent. They look at investment within the community, they look at investment within their fans as a way for sustainable approach. So it isn't about being dependent on the TV revenues or whatever. You become more secure by doing that. And that's where we look at the sustainability index. If you have money that comes through and that money is spent in those areas, then you get a more sustainable, long-term, secure football club.
Look, and I think that's a great message to finish on. It's clear from the comments in the commentary box and the conversation we've had today that there needs to be some change. COVID obviously has shone a light on that and has also highlighted the hugely impactful role football clubs can play in their communities. And I think the agreement amongst all is that there needs to be some change, and now is the time to do that. There's an extraordinary opportunity to effect some change that can bring about a far more sustainable world for football right through the pyramid in the UK. So I'd like to thank you all for joining. Apologies for a few technical hiccups at the start, but that's the world we live in these days. So Niall, we wish you all the very best with fair play. I'm sure you'll have continue to have a huge impact on the game with that. Natalie, thank you very much indeed for being part of the conversation. And John, fantastic to get your insights and views from the financial side. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we look forward to speaking to you all again in the near future. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.